but I thought we can. So this is the first committee meeting for the Policy and Governance Committee. So the committee members are Member Doucette, myself, and Member Fakarani, and Vice Chair here to observe. So just a little bit about the committee. Committee is an advisory committee. We receive your presentation and we make recommendation to the board, and the board will have the final say. So we don't, basically, we can debate, we can, any recommendation we have, it still have to go to the board for approval. So basically, we don't make decision on committee. For that reason, we are 4, and we could be a full board. It doesn't make a difference because we're here just as an advisory committee. So because if we to make a decision here, we can't be more than 3, than the 4th member. But since no decision be making, so we can be more than 4. I'd like to call this meeting the Policy and Governance Committee to order for May 12, 2022. We'll begin with a land acknowledgement. I'd like to recognize that Ottawa is located on unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Host Nation. The peoples of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation have lived on this territory for millennia. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. The Ottawa Police Service Board honor the people and the land of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation. Today, Ottawa is a home to approximately 40,000 First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people. Ottawa's Indigenous community is diverse, representing many nations, language, and customs. The Ottawa Police Service Board honor all First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people and their valuable past and present contribution to this land. With that, the first item is to elect a chair for the committee. So our first order of business is to elect committee chair. I will now open the floor for nomination from my fellow committee members, Fakarani and Member Doucette. I can myself nominate Member Doucette to be chair of this committee. Any other nomination? No. Member Doucette, will you accept?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm pleased. I am pleased to be the committee. Oh, that's for you, Mike. That's for you. My God. So regiment, whatever just before I turn it over to the chair, when it comes to the minute received, we're going to use the word receive instead of confirm, Mr. Chair, if I may. Because we were not on the committee at the time of those minutes, so we can only receive them instead of confirm. But I turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Right to work, I guess.
Yes, sir.
Great, thank you. I'm very pleased to be the committee chair for the Policy and Governance Committee. Like all committees, this is very important, and I believe both governance and policy are important to us. Let me begin by proceeding with the confirmation of the agenda for today. So confirmation of the agenda that the Policy and Governance Committee confirmed the agenda of the 12th May 2022 meeting. Is the agenda confirmed?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Thank you very much. Now on to the next confirmation of minutes or receiving the minutes, that the Policy and Governance Committee can receive the minutes from number 9 from the 10 January 2022 meeting. Are the minutes confirmed? Received, I'm sorry. Yeah. Is there any business arising from the minutes? Let's move on to the items of business. We have 3 items of business on the agenda today. The first item of business includes a presentation from OPS staff on 2020 use of forest race data. So should we move on to that one? Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. So I'll start with good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. Chair Doucette, congratulations, I believe, on being appointed chair, being elected chair to this. We're happy to have you. Thank you to all the board members for your ongoing commitment to what you do. I know it takes lots of effort and time, but I actually think we're before you today. You're going to present some progressive work that we identify as a service we need to do, and that we are absolutely committed to doing. As you've seen, there's a large contingent of members, community members, of academic experts around the table who have really helped collaborate in terms of looking at the data we have and actually helping to move us forward. So we have a presentation, we have, I have some brief opening comments. Members of our team, members of the academic team, as well as Community Equity Council will present on information, and then we'll be able to engage in conversation, answer questions, because I think that's the best part of these committees. So with that, last year we engaged York University and Ontario Tech Public Policy and race-based data collection leaders, Dr. Les Jacobs and Dr. Lauren Foster, to review race data associated with use of force reports filed by the Ottawa Police Service members in 2020. The OPS has leveraged their expertise in the past. From 2013 to 2018, we undertook the largest race-based data collection in Canadian policing history with the Traffic Stop race-based data collection project. We know that the results of those studies are essential for measuring inequities and disproportionalities that affect the people we serve. We acknowledge that systemic racism and barriers exist in our society, and we know that these issues also exist in policing. Policing is a vital service, and we must work to ensure that it treats everyone fairly and equitably. We know currently that it does not. Before you hear our presenters, I want to lay out some of the highlights. In 2020, amongst the 314,000 calls for service, there were 348 use of force incidents reported involving 427 people. The study found there was disproportionately high incidents involving Black, Middle Eastern, and Indigenous persons as compared to percentages of the population of the rest of the community. While this does not speak to causes, it's consistent with other studies like the traffic stop race data collection study. We need to understand these disparities and work to eliminate them. And we're taking steps to identify and resolve these matters. A key element to the work is our community engagement. We continue to support, resource, co-lead the Community Equity Council, which provides valuable insights and guidance on initiatives impacting Ottawa's communities. Our members are an integral part of these discussions. No one wants to see systemic issues negatively affect our people and our communities. It's our members' engagement on this issue that will be a major factor in any positive change moving us forward. This discussion is vital to the future of policing and the communities that we serve. The studies created an opportunity to have a productive conversation in our community, and discussions will lead to change. The OPS accepts all of the York Ontario Tech team's recommendations, which has led to developing a use of force review committee in partnership with the Community Equity Council, which is comprised of police and community members to review reports on use of force incidents, similarly to what we have done in respect to violence against women issues. Moving forward with a new diverse hiring plan that is representative of our community. Hiring an equity and race data specialist to continue providing efforts to increase reporting on police data, such as traffic stops and arrests, and build a community data hub for increased data transparency. Increasing our anti-racism and cultural awareness training, making it mandatory for all members, and moving forward on our equity, diversity, and inclusion 3-year action plan. Throughout all these processes, we're working closely with our community partners and experts in the field to ensure that we are developing best practices to address how police implement use of force techniques, as well as identifying those most impacted. Identification of these disparities is the first step towards understanding how this affects our racialized communities, as well as reducing or eliminating perceived barriers to reporting. This important work will help us to resolve inequities in our response, continuing the rollout of responsive internal education and training programs, and co-develop solutions that lead to lasting and systemic changes. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Daniel Kopke to continue with our presentation.
All right, thank you, Chief. This afternoon, we're presenting the 2020 Annual Use of Force Report, along with the results and findings of the study we commissioned on use of force-based data. The results reflect long-standing and unresolved systemic racism and related intersectional issues that are still found in the justice system, other institutions, and our largest society. As you heard from Interim Chief Bell, the Ottawa Police Service is committed to impacting change. We are on a journey towards a more inclusive and equitable organization, both internally amongst our membership and externally in our service delivery to Ottawa's diverse communities. Like any journey, having a roadmap to guide our path is vital. And when it comes to equity and inclusion, data is key to forging that path. But how related data is framed and selected is crucial. And results require meaningful analysis, understanding, and interpretation. There is still much to learn in this regard. Today, we will share with you the results of OPS findings related to use of force instances. We'll also discuss the context for race data collection and subsequent analysis. We will share key findings and share with you continued efforts in use of force and equity work. Lastly, we'll provide insight on the path we are forging with our community partners.
Police officers in Canada have a common law duty to protect life and public safety. To fulfill this duty, they must at times use force. To not use force to protect public safety may be considered a dereliction of duty that may result in the officer being charged under the Police Services Act or under the Criminal Code. While the use of force is not expressly sanctioned under common law, it includes an understanding that force may at times be required. To support the use of force application in service delivery, OPS officers receive dedicated training on use of force procedures and regular requalification training. Police officers in Canada are also authorized to use force by federal statute, provincial statute, and service policy and procedure. The theory of use of force is guided by the use of force model, which is pictured to the right of the graphic. The use of force model was developed to assist in the training of police officers and serve as a reference when making decisions and explaining officers' actions with respect to use of force. The model does not justify an officer's actions, rather identifies to the officer the steps they must take to ensure the actions they take are appropriate and measured. It assists to ensure the most reasonable and proportionate application of force in all circumstances. In 2020, officers were dispatched to just under 220,700 calls. These calls resulted in nearly 8,000 arrests and slightly more than 2,000 mental health apprehensions. The reporting on use of force data in 2020 indicates a total of 348 incidents where use of force was involved, involving 427 subjects. This represents less than 0.16% of the total police responses in 2021 and 3.1% of the responses which resulted in arrest. Use of force reporting allows us to further analyze data by call type. Of the 348 use of force incidents in 2020, 40 were for mental health apprehensions, 36 were for warrant service, 13 were for suspicious persons, 50 were for disturbance calls, and 93 for weapons calls. For the first time in 2020, the provincial use of force report included a data capture on specifically race data. We turn the discussion next to the impact of use of force instances on racialized and Indigenous communities.
The Anti-Racism Act requires public sector organizations to collect, analyze, and report on race-based data with the goal of identifying and eliminating systemic racism and racial disparity in access to services and outcomes. The legislation applies to organizations across education, child welfare, and the justice sectors. On January 1st, 2020, Ontario's data standards for the identification and monitoring of systemic racism came into effect and provides direction to police services collecting disaggregated race-based data for police interventions requiring the use of force reports. As such, this is the first fulsome standalone report on use of force by the OPS, and there's therefore no previous comparative data. The impact of use of force on racialized communities is a critical issue for police services and one that must be addressed. As part of OPS strategic priority to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion, data collection on use of force, as well as subsequent analysis and interpretation, is and will continue to be a top priority. Given this, we have once again turned to Dr. Foster and Dr. Jenkins to guide critical analysis of the data collected with respect to instances of use of force. While the Ottawa Police Service is required to provide an annual use of force report to the Ottawa Police Service Board, that's annually, this more robust and in-depth look took additional time and resources to incorporate the new provincial legislative requirements for the 2020 reporting year. As you'll see shortly, the first year results do highlight disproportionality for some communities, particularly Black and Middle Eastern communities. This is unacceptable in Ottawa, or for that matter, anywhere. These numbers are consistent with the findings of other police services across Canada. Indeed, police services across the country must work to better understand and address the disproportionate use of force against racialized persons, as well as other citizen interactions where bias or systemic racism may be at play. This includes improving data collection and analysis and reporting beyond legislative requirements to better understand the context of these incidents to develop the right solutions for impacted communities. The Ottawa Police Service is committed to completing this work with our community partners. Now I'll turn it over to Dr. Jacob.
Thank you. As you heard, the OPS does hand in annual reports of use of force yearly, of course. And this year, under provincial obligation, they were required to add race to that data collection process. And the findings of the OPS data collection with respect to use of force and our subsequent analysis focused on that first year, that first 12-month period of race data collection that was introduced by the use of force reports, SOGEN, use of force reports. And as you heard, there were 348 use of force incidents, which involved 427 subjects during that time frame of 2020. An important broad objective of the analysis was to determine whether there were any disproportionalities or high incidences of racialization or racialized subjects experiencing use of force incidents involving the Ottawa Police Service. And the benchmark for measuring disproportionately high incidents is the general population, or what we call residential benchmark, census benchmark, in relation to different racial groups. And the benchmark was used or calculated or developed through the Stats Canada microdata for the 2016 census. The 2021 census has been completed, of course, but that data collection of those census data products are going to be released this year, and we could use that updated data. Now, what was the findings? What did the data tell us? Well, as was mentioned, there was overrepresentation of particular groups. The OPS data collection revealed disproportionalities in relation to Blacks, in relation to Middle Eastern people, individuals, and Indigenous subjects. Individuals who were perceived by officers to be Black had use of force against them 4.8 times more than what you'd expect given their segment of the population. Individuals who were perceived by officers to be Middle Eastern had force used against them 2.4 times more than what you'd expect given their segment of the population. And individuals who were perceived by officers to be white had use of force less against them, significantly less than one, well, less than 100% of their population and segment of the population. And they were less likely to experience serious use of force outcomes. Now, there's a need to keep moving forward towards developing a higher level of sophistication or a higher level of objectivity and measurability through improved statistical measures going along. It's important to realize that in this year, adding race to an existing data collection system is not the end of the story. We need to refine that data collection system to actually adapt to this new reality, this new vision that we're looking for in terms of racial disparities. And in that measure, we suggest that you could use a more multiple benchmarking approach. Residential benchmarking is good. It gives you a slice of reality, so to speak, in terms of looking at police-citizen interactions. But you could also use enforcement actions as a benchmark. All enforcement interactions by police could be a benchmark. Some forces have thought about or considered that. And that would involve tickets and summonses and cautions, any kind of enforcement action that officers take in the community. Multiple demographic variables can be experienced through a sort of intersectional benchmarking or intersectional analysis. So adding gender, adding age gives you a more sophisticated and nuanced view of what's happening between police and citizens. Also, geographic variables can be added to the data collection process. Location, for instance, or neighborhoods, division, time, charges laid, etc. All of that is available and can be explored in the data that's been collected. Multiple outcome measures, which can form findings in racial disparities in terms of the highest use of force, severity of use of force, etc. Levels of harm, including not only physical harm, which is measured now in terms of those who require medical assistance, but also psychological harm can be a variable that could be measured in relation to the community. And finally, I just want to say before I turn over to Les that racial disparities on their own don't tell the full story. They don't tell us how, or why, or where these differential these disparities exist. And we need to link the use of force data to more administrative data, to the internal data in better ways to understand use of force and give us a more rich and robust source of information and for analysis of race data and more nuanced and sort of three-dimensional understanding of the relationship between police and citizens.
Thanks, Lauren. I'll just briefly build on some of Lauren's comments. Obviously, what we're suggesting is that the real breakthrough of this report is the collection of disaggregated race data. That's a major watershed that can't really be exaggerated as it's in terms of its significance, and that has been done for this report. And secondly, the linking to some of the internal data that the service has, like for example, as you saw in the second slide, the image of the pie, the connection to calls for service, which again is an example where it gives a bit of context and helps to understand what exactly is going on in particular instances of use of force. And partly it's because if you're thinking about use of force incidents, to a certain extent, there's a sort of a glass half full question, right? Because clearly this 350 incidences are a very small proportion of the number of incidents that clearly were de-escalated. And what can we learn from all those success stories, which truthfully don't enter into the data at all, because they're seemingly invisible without fully know what the nature of those calls are. How in particular calls, is there ways in which we can better understand where de-escalation works. All of those pieces that ideally putting things in context around that will actually really move the conversation forward. And I don't think anybody in this room thinks that collecting this data just for the point of collecting data is actually really to push things forward. And so really that's an aspect of what we're strongly recommending that the service continue to push forward. The second piece that Lauren was alluding to, but again goes back to the original graphic, is that the graphic or the benchmark that we used for the ratio is residential population. It's 2016, and maybe 2021 will change slightly those numbers and so on, but there clearly are other benchmarks and ones that don't currently exist in the data. A really good one is, we know that 400 of these incidents, 50 incidents out of 8,000 arrests. But we don't actually have disaggregated race data for those 8,000 arrests. Until we have that data, then we can't really use arrests as a benchmark. And again, if you're going to kind of think about, if you're going back to what works in de-escalation, is it better to think about all calls for service, or is it rather to think about de-escalation in context of arrest? So on. We don't know the answer to that until we actually have good evidence data. So we're sort of, what we're saying is two sort of moves. One is to actually understand the context better. Second is to actually have more robust benchmarks so that we can actually really better have insight on what the disproportionalities, disparities really are. And those sort of two, they kind of go in hand in hand, but you do want to separate them out. And going forward, and some of them are easier to do than others. And really a glaring example around the intersectional data, the fact that there's no gender data, no age data, is a really, just a striking example where that's basically not the OPS's issue in a way. It's actually the provincial use of force form that hopefully we'll see movement even on that that'll quickly develop. So those are sort of where we're seeing the future. Obviously, in general, our point is that this is the first time this has been done. Next year, as independent benchmark is, we'll be able to compare it to this year. And that in itself will also be a trajectory. Obviously, again, ideally you want that trajectory to be a positive one, even though realistically, I don't think anybody thinks that it's going to be solved overnight.
Thank you, Dr. Jacobs. Foster. Building on that theme, the Canadian Centre for Justice and Community Safety Statistics recognizes the shortcomings of race and social identity data collection in policing. In fact, July 15th, 2020, Statistics Canada and the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police released a joint statement committing to working with Canada's policing community and organizations to collect police-reported information on Indigenous and racialized identity of all victims and accused persons as it pertains to criminal incidents. This mutual commitment is a response to growing demands for such information as a way of contributing to better understanding of the experience of First Nations people in UA, Métis, and racialized groups when interacting with police. Stats Canada has just recently, in fact, completed its first public engagement to inform this initiative. It involved input from diverse perspectives on data collection, including community organizations, academics, police services, and other parties of interest at the national, provincial, territorial, municipal, and local government level. The engagement sought feedback on the value of collecting Indigenous and racialized identity data through our use of our survey, but also included feedback on how police should collect data more broadly, as you just heard. In short, we recognize that better, more complete data that will not only shed light on experience of Indigenous and racialized groups as they relate to policing and the criminal justice system more broadly, but also help us in identifying root causes, focus our efforts, focus our investments, and measure the effectiveness of those interventions is needed. That being said, as we work to implement the recommendations contained within this report by Dr. Foster and Dr. Jacobs, OPS also continues with other equity-related initiatives to improve service delivery. Officers continue to receive extensive use of force training, as well as de-escalation and communications training. We have ramped up our anti-racism cultural awareness training, making it mandatory for all members, and providing trauma-informed awareness and bystander training to complement the anti-racism content. We hold steadfast in our commitment to EDI with continued application and implementation of our 3-year action plan and putting key resources in place to improve analytics. Key to all of this is community engagement. We continue to support, resource, and co-lead the Community Equity Council, CEC, who provide invaluable insight and guidance on these initiatives impacting the owner. And now we'll turn it over to Joe Riggs of the CEC.
Thanks. So first I want to just start by acknowledging the board. Thank you for taking on these responsibilities because they're big. And thank you colleagues and partners for inviting us. And I really just publicly want to acknowledge Lesson One because they've been amazing partners to work with. And they have such an intersectional lens, as you could see, that it really helped us in terms of being able to work together. I'm going to apologize that Sahana and Jalil can't be with you. The chair and the vice chair of the CEC, they both are at work. So you're stuck with me, sorry. Oh, and just heads up, my change to speaking notes for all of you reading, too late. So it's not gonna work. So there's 4 recommendations coming out of the review of the 2020 use of force report. And as stated earlier, the recommendations were developed through conversations with the CEC, committee members, the OPS, and the York researchers. And so they were very generous in actually handing us in advance and saying, let's do this together. So while their recommendations, the OPS has actually been working and we're already moving forward on some of them. Just to talk about the CEC, many of the community members came to the CEC and our work with the police because of a deep commitment to change. And part of that change for many of us is we can all name a use of force incident that really motivated us to want to work with the police. For me, it's Greg Ritchie when he died, and for many of the CEC, it's Abdirahman and Abdi. What we all knew that something really terrible had happened in our community when the people that are there to protect us didn't protect us, and in fact, harm was done, and we needed to understand that. As a CEC and as community members from the Indigenous, faith-based, and racialized communities, we all know how our communities experience use of force. And so we want answers. And so when we came to the CEC, for us, this is an incredible opportunity to be able to really dig deep in terms of what happened in this interaction between 2 people. And we're excited about the data, but we want more. So the first recommendation, a comprehensive data strategy, it actually acknowledges the current state of data collection in the OPS today and lays out a really clear intent around data collection and data use and data analysis. So currently race-based data is collected by the OPS for traffic stops and use of force, but they're analyzed separately. And we also know that there's gaps in the data collected, as Lauren and Les pointed out, which really impact the ability of the OPS to respond to our communities. And the first recommendation, really what we wanted to do is really embed an ongoing relationship between the OPS, racialized and Indigenous and faith-based communities to identify what needs to be collected, to ensure that we're analyzing that data, because we have a very different perspective when we look at that data, and then to actually bring it together so that we can come up with solutions and recommendations. And it really further supports recommendation, that transparency we all want. But we want to be able to report to the entire community and not just the police board about what is happening. I want to really present an example of data we need and the impact it can have in saving lives. So the OPS currently does not collect data related to indigeneity. I'm saying Thompson. So in my other role as the facilitator for the Ottawa Aboriginal Coalition, we established an Indigenous Women Safety Table, and it's implementing the recommendations for the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. And so one of our 4 working groups is a police working group. The first recommendation that came out of that working group was collect indigeneity for missing persons. We are 16 times more likely to be murdered. If we don't collect and we don't flag that that's an Indigenous woman, we're not connecting to the community to be able to potentially save her life. So data is not just about let's analyze it and let's research it. It actually saves lives, and we want to do that kind of service response shift really quickly. And so that's why we're asking them to move forward on some of these right away, and OPS is moving forward on this. The other 3 recommendations are specifically about use of force. So the use of force report is a legislative requirement, and it outlines what data to collect. And as the researchers really said, this is an opportunity to improve our community and make change happen through sharing really relevant information and really creating an intersectional framework around it. And so the second recommendation is extended to expand our data to be able to truly understand what happened in that use of force event. This is a really complex story, and it's actually going to require OPS to grapple with a lot of issues because we have a lot of distrust in our communities around sharing information with police and asking any more information. We don't want to give it to you. Indigenous, Black, and racialized communities are not predisposed to share information with the police. So how do we collect data in communities where there's been over-policing, where we actually know use of force has happened, and we really don't trust the police? So, and how do we collect data in a trauma-informed way? Because as the police have come at different times, that when Greg died, the police did come to Wabano, and we sat together, and basically we said, we don't trust you. We don't have a relationship of trust. So, we need to establish that before we were going to share anything with you. So data is not going to be easy to collect. The third recommendation is intended to really strengthen connections between all sets of data in the OPS and build on recommendation 1. But ultimately, the CBC actually hopes we connect the OPS data with other city data, because we're actually tired of things being siloed. We don't find it that useful. The city of Ottawa recently did the 2021 PIT count. In that PIT count, racialized and Indigenous people were the highest. So on October 2021, when you did your PIT count, 32% of homeless are Indigenous. And so that's an issue for us, because we know the homeless has a very close relationship with the police. Our services are not open 24/7. So they're interacting constantly with them. We want to have an understanding of that, the homelessness relationship and use of force. Is there a relationship or is there not? Those are the kind of questions we want to get really deeper into. The fourth and final recommendation is about learning from the data and making decisions in OPS to shift their practice. As the chief mentioned earlier, there are a number of actions already in motion with respect to this recommendation. And I want to highlight 2. One, because I'm really happy about them both. We need a deeper analysis of the 911 process. We know that a person calling and the 911 dispatcher and the OPS member all have their own biases. And so how does that actually impact the use of force incident? So how do we minimize those biases being transferred actually through the whole system and with each interaction? Because what we know is if racism is embedded in the first call, and then it goes to the dispatcher, and then it goes to the police member, what's the impact? Does it elevate their relationship with that person whoever they're meeting? That 911 review work has actually started with the OPS's participation in the Ottawa Mental Health and Addictions Guiding Council. And we're currently looking at the current 911 calls around mental health. And so that's one piece that we think is really important to have a conversation around. And the second one is what Intern Chief Bill talked about, which is the OPS through the CDC has established a use of force working group. And it's going to actually review the very specific use of force incidents and provide recommendations for action out of it. And so we want to transform data. We really want to recognize that it's information, but it gets reduced to what the social identity markers and situational indicators. And that's not good enough for our communities. What we need to do is actually take that data, transform that data back into that person and back into that story. And then we can understand what happened between that police member and that community member that led to use of force. And we want to make it real again. And so the story will actually help us to know what systems and processes need to change at OPS. But for us, we also want to really ask other questions because the police are in relationship and we are all in relationship to each other. So there's other systems and processes that need to change. And so even for us as the Indigenous community, we have to move to having more 24/7 services because we really don't want them always interacting with you, no offense, but we want to be able to really move to that place where, but what we need the data to know where is the places we need to start with. And so that some of these answers I think is going to be really exciting because it's going to help us build other services and supports that we've needed. And we really recognize this is really hard work and it's relational work, it's collaborative work. We need help to do it. I mean, I really have to look at it in terms of we're trying to change a system that's embedded in a colonial construct. So we actually all need to be recognizing and with great humility our part in that and then making those shifts. So I wanted to close with actually Alison told me to close with these words, Thomas King. So Thomas King, he's a Cherokee Canadian author. I think a lot of you know him. But he says, if we change the stories we live by, quite possibly we change our lives. And for us, that's what data means to us, is we're actually trying to change and improve people's lives. And so that's, I want to thank you too for doing all that work for us, because that was amazing.
So Mr. Chair, that is our presentation. I know there's a lot of information there and we're really looking forward to having a discussion around it. What's really important for me to highlight right now is to thank Joan for her leadership in the CEC. Thank Lauren and Les for their leadership in the data analysis. I can tell you this, Joan's absolutely right. This is hard work, but it's important work and it's work that police can't do alone. And we're very open as a policing organization to look at how we partner with our community, how we partner with academics to get good data. But getting good data isn't enough to actually action that data and make changes and see improvements in what that data looks like down the road. So we're really looking forward to having discussions, answering any questions. And this is the first step of what is a long road that we are absolutely committed to taking.
Great. Thank you, Chief, and thank you to all the presenters for the very knowledgeable and thought-provoking presentation. Before going to questions and comments from the committee members today and any board members that are joining us, we will hear from the public delegation, Robin Brown. Mr. Brown, you have 5 minutes and you can go ahead.
Thank you.
At the front, if you don't mind. Yes, there's a chair set up. Yeah. There's no microphone, just. So we're doing our best with the technology we have, so there's no microphones in this room.
On your laptop or?
By the iPad. It's an experiment.
Okay. In January, I told the previous board how we had asked the OPS for its use of force rate data several times, and how the OPS had politely several times said they didn't have it, and that we had to get it from the Ontario Solicitor General. And I said that when we asked the Solicitor General for the data, they told us to ask the OPS because the OPS had it. I said the OPS's response begged the question: did
Superintendent Isabel Granger and Mark Patterson, who told us the OPS didn't have the data, simply have their information wrong, or were they both lying? I said this appeared to be another example of the OPS actively trying to suppress data. That's very important for you board members to do your job and very important for the public to know. Or it might just show that the OPS isn't very good at managing sensitive data. Either way, it wasn't good. At the same January meeting, former board member Sandy Smallwood asked former Chief Slowly to provide the use of force raised data at the board's February meeting, and Chief Slowly agreed. Then truckers Occupy Ottawa, while the OPS stood by and watched. Unnamed OPS sources in the media blamed the OPS inaction on former Chief Slowly, saying they were, quote, paralyzed because he was too busy allegedly bullying senior staff to give them proper direction, and Chief Slowly took the fall and resigned. The OPS never produced their use of force rate data until now. Now, somehow the OPS has found the data and is going to share it today. Let's be clear. The OPS collected this data and is sharing it now because the province ordered them to over 2 years ago. And from what we see, the data paints, she said, paints much the same picture as the OPS traffic stop data that the OPS was also forced to collect, and that is that the OPS disproportionately uses force on Black and Middle Eastern men. Now, this isn't surprising. Thanks. Let's remember who we're dealing with. Rank and file OPS officers elected Ottawa Police Association President Matt Scoff in 2011 and have let him run uncontested twice since then. This despite the fact that Scoff was caught on tape calling a Black female member of the Justice for Abjure Men Coalition a racist, sexist slur so vile I won't repeat it here. And that Scoff still faces breach of trust charges from the Ontario French Police after being caught on tape discussing an open police investigation. How about you? The problem with the OPS isn't just a few bad apples, it's that the tree is rotten to the core. And these are the same people for whom the previous board approved $2 million for new tasers at the very same meeting where we exposed the OPS apparently lying about not having any use of force data. The board gave new tasers to the very people who have just confirmed they use force more on Black and Middle Eastern men. Same people whose tasers we didn't see at all during the occupation of Ottawa by mostly white people, or the operation that finally removed them. And these are the people who plan to hire 80 more officers to add to their rotten tree. Now, just how rotten is the OPS tree? Well, it's impossible to know because hiding stuff is a key part of what makes the OPS rotten. An example of this is the many freedom of information requests we filed that all come back with the same response: denied. We asked the OPS for a list of their approved use of force methods, something that's public. Denied. We asked them for the report of one of the OPS's most publicized use of force incidents when they showed up en masse with guns drawn on a group of young Black men shooting a music video in the Seulement parking lot. Denied. This backs up our belief the OPS is really good at only 3 things: protecting the powerful, avoiding accountability, and increasing their budget. We filed a complaint with the Ontario Civilian Police Commission against the former board for approving the tasers, and we call on this board to do 3 things. 1, stop limiting public participation in board meetings by allowing virtual public delegations. 2, complete an effective use of force review done by the former board in consultation with grassroots community groups. And 3, hire an independent firm in consultation with grassroots community groups to do a formal performance review of the board that the board was supposed to do last year. And this fall, we call on this board to continue the process of abolishing the Ottawa Police by massively defunding them and continuing the community conversations about what systems we should fund and create to truly make us all safer. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown.
Any questions? Seeing none.
Now we'll turn to the committee members for any questions on the presentation.
Let me begin by thanking the professor. It seems that quite sometimes one of the things you mentioned was with the race data collection. It's going to be improvement now with what the province had to do. That is going to change any of of your finding or any of your study? Because you've been on it for now, how many years? The race data collection and now. over 10. So are you expecting changes to it?
Well, I'm not really privy to what the province is going to add to their data collection form. Probably better to ask Chief.
Yeah, so the province hasn't yet announced any updates to their form and how they would recommend that police services collect data. One thing we've been really clear on from the beginning is that for us is a base standard. That's a minimum mandatory requirement. We are going to build sets of data, sets of systems in collaboration with our community and with experts around data collection that fit our needs. So we won't, we started the data collection around use of force based on provincial minimum requirements. We've now drawn on that, and from that we've identified areas where we need to have improvements. We're committed to creating those improvements, working with experts from both academics and community to look at what that requires and how we do that. So although the province hasn't yet identified what it is, that for us isn't where we'll end. We need to get the right data to help us direct operations.
The reason through the chair, the reason I asked that question, because we started race data collection without any guidance from the province. Right? And now we're hearing with the added on from the province, is that gonna change? It's gonna be fundamental change, like your expectation on what they're adding on, because we have no other service to compare with. Obviously we're out of the gate before province for any other service. So how could we compare ourselves to the other?
So, well, right now we do have comparisons, and what the comparison is the data is consistent across the province, across the country. Our position on it is that's not good enough. So we need to improve the outcomes. We need to improve our service, particularly to marginalized, racialized, and Indigenous communities. And we will continue to work against our own benchmarks to look at how we decrease and ultimately eliminate that disproportionality. You're right when you say we are ahead of the curve on this. We're working with two of the foremost experts in the country in this area, and they can better comment where we situate ourselves. But what I will say is that we will take their direction, we will take their guidance, and it will be in consultation with the community who need to gather this data. We can't compare to other organizations around what we're doing when we lead the way, but that's not going to stop us from leading the way.
And I don't think we heard it through the presentation. The data collection, if it includes gender and age, what do you expect to learn from gender and age with the data collection?
Well, I mean, so in the let me just make a quick comment that the Anti-Racism Act that was mentioned in the slide. The Anti-Racism Act is a game changer in Ontario, enacted in 2017, but really the regulations, which in effect have set the first race data standard in Canada, and part of the problem with Statistics Canada, they don't have a race data standard, which is why they're in some of the 2017 legislation mandate the establishment of the race data standard. Truthfully, we played a pretty big role in setting that standard. But that standard includes a lot of the details and prescription about what constitutes the best practices in race data. Then the current use of force form was never designed for human rights purposes. The Anti-Racism Act is a human rights piece of legislation. The data standard was data standard. So the use of force form originally was never intended for human rights purposes. They've added race and using the category as part of the standard in that act, but it only partially. And ideally, what will happen in the next iteration of the form is that the form will better comply with the data standards and likely it will take a number of stages. We have seen the draft, and probably some of the people on the table have seen the draft as circulated. But so there are developments. To come back to the age and gender question, certainly from the perspective of racialized communities, it's not, in many of those communities, they don't think it's just randomly distributed across those communities. They actually think that, for example, that there's a high concentration, say, among young Black men. And right now, we just don't have the data to confirm that. But it actually, again, comes back to some of those points does de-escalation not take that into account, or are there measures that can be better forward-looking when you have a better understanding of who the subjects are on those intersectional data? And obviously geography, all of those things that we also are saying will probably provide significant insight into going forward and reducing those numbers. And of course, but already in our report, we do explicitly, as Lauren was pointing out, we do explicitly talk about not only use of force is a continuum, it's not a all or nothing. And the types of use of force, again, are not randomly distributed based on race. And likely they're not randomly distributed when you have intersectional data around age and gender. And so that will also give some insight into what kind of measures can actually reduce not just use of force, but use of force if the most serious or life-threatening or psychologically impactful exercise.
Let me just add to the intersectional framework in terms of race, gender, age. If you recall our race data collection study here, we were able to break it down in terms of race, gender, age, and we found that, it gives significant information to young Black males under 24 experience traffic stops more than others, or 12% of the numbers of the population, et cetera. Those are invisible realities that are exposed simply by having that intersectional framework from which to view what's going on up there. Right? And similarly, we can see with Middle Eastern males, 16 to 24, et cetera. And so those things are revealed. They're like prisms that provide more information to give us a fuller picture of what's happening. So it's very important to have those kinds of what's called intersectional lenses or frameworks from which to assess situations like this or phenomena or interactions like this.
I'm going to finish. Just a quick follow-up on it. But isn't the use of force data almost similar to the traffic stop data when you say a high percentage of young Black male or Middle Eastern male? Isn't the number almost?
Well, the numbers are significantly disproportionate. Let's put it that way. The same as we found with the traffic stop data. But we had a lot more intricate view in terms of the breakdowns in terms of the traffic stop data. We can get that same breakdown, and it's not just getting the breakdown. It allows you to actually create initiatives that improve policing, that improve the process, that actually eliminate or reduce any kind of bias that's unknown or unconscious out there that might exist. So it's important to have a rich, detailed, robust picture of what's going on, and we don't have that yet in terms of use of force data. Now, of course, it's just the 1 year that we've been collecting race, as Les was pointing out, in terms of being a new variable added to an old system, right? So it needs to be refined. It needs to be updated, so to speak, and improved in the same way that our race data, in terms of the race traffic stop data. And you'll note, I want to tell, I don't know how to place this, maybe Les can, because we work on the anti-racism data standards. You'll note that those standards are the same standards we used with how many, 10 years before? No, 5 years before. So if there's consistency with the work that's going on here, that actually is going to be comparable. If you say how we compare, it's going to be comparable because there's consistency provided now legally through through the human rights instrument of the Anti-Racism Act.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll stop.
Thank you, everyone, all the presenters. I really appreciate it, and a lot of work has been done, I can see. A couple of issues that come to mind is I'm really pleased to see the humanization of the data that Joe mentioned. That's very clear that there's a good working relationship with the Ottawa Police Service, including the deeper analysis of 911 calls. What I want to speak to is the numbers are alarming, 4.8% higher, 4.8 times higher for Black, 2.4 for Middle East. And I didn't catch the number for Indigenous. I wanted to have a clear idea of Indigenous.
It's in our
So and we can get them, but clearly it's higher than the societal numbers. So they are alarming.
One point. But just the caveat there is small numbers, which make risks, whereas the Middle Eastern and Black numbers are large numbers that we're very confident. Again, you can imagine that compared to the traffic stop data where we had roughly about 100,000 traffic stops a year. Here we have 327 instances, 427 individuals. And so a shift of five individuals can actually significantly change small numbers, whereas obviously 5 and 100,000 makes no sense.
Okay. So one of my questions is this. So what we've done is basically we've taken anecdotal stories and we're actually putting real numbers, great numbers. I think that's what's so beneficial to this exercise, that we can say, look, this is what the data is actually showing and demonstrating and proving. And that is really beneficial to the community. But this has been around for some time, and I'm hoping professors can speak to this. It's not a novel issue. And so when we ask how, why, what are the root causes, in your experience, could you speak to some of those issues?
Thanks. I mean, so I mean, I think that there are probably, I would sort of separate out sort of three causes. One is, what is for sure true is that police services are often a microcosm of all public services and indeed entire Ottawa community. So it's not as if systemic racism is a unique issue for the Ottawa Police Service, and obviously Joel's comments are kind of sort of relevant to making that. So and again, that's not an excuse. That's just sort of to make an observation, and it's not a surprise that the service can't insulate itself from that. And of course, that's part of the reason why the 911 calls are a really interesting example, where when community members make 911 calls and themselves have calls that have racism embedded in them, then they're magnified through 911 calls and in Lauren's language, it's sort of police become proxies for community or societal racism. That is for sure an issue. Second is implicit bias, maybe explicit bias, but let's say implicit bias among the police themselves. And again, I think that you've heard from the chief today, but I think it's been a pretty consistent message from the OPS and for kudos for to be one of the leading Canadian services to actually embrace or acknowledge that now a number of years ago. That is absolutely a factor. And again, that works in a number of complex ways. And indeed, there's a lot of work that says that implicit bias is often across, say, sworn members, for example, regardless of what the race is of that particular member, right? It's, you know, that is part of the complexity of it. The third one is really around operations and traditional practices. One thing we do know that police, again, like most public service providers, there are many operations that have proceeded, that have been in existence for a long time, all sorts of deployment issues, basically how the police conduct business. And those practices, those operations have very, very rarely been scrutinized through a human rights lens, let alone an anti-racism law. And indeed, you know, both have experiences together, where we go in with do presentations to police services, and sworn members would kind of basically ask questions like, the Police Services Act overrides the Human Rights Code. These kinds of, you know, and we don't hear that as much, but that is a relatively recent development. But it does get at, there are a lot of operations that you can rethink, that policies, operations, and those are likely to be significant contributors. And to a certain extent, part of our work on the traffic stops data in the last reporting was to really try to draw out how some of the ways in which particular traffic units were deployed. For example, in response to increased break and enters in a particular racialized community, and you deploy traffic stop units if they were easy to redeploy. And those traffic units would in turn pose more tickets, do more stops, even though the community was calling because of break and enters, not because those people driving through stop signs. And but if you want, those deployments actually would result in increased racial disparities in terms of traffic stuff. Those are sort of this, I would say, the three things I would highlight in particular that a systemic racism lens really would highlight, but probably others.
No, I think that they covered it well, but the good news there, even though systemic discrimination, systemic racism is a complex issue that involves organizations, individuals, and regulations and rules and practices, data collection can be a tool to expose all of it, so you can redesign your instrument, right? So data collection is very, very important for whatever complexity of systemic discrimination you're talking about, whether it's deployment patterns, or whether it's implicit bias, or whether it's organizational culture. Data collection is important for revealing that, and then you can do something. Then you can find solutions. So we are, data collection scientists, I guess we call ourselves, and human rights expert, and we're very, very grateful to be involved with Ottawa Police. We had some meetings in the car today because we had busy schedules, but we would have missed this meeting because Ottawa is, I don't live here, I don't know the reality on the ground, but I do know that the spirit of the police, in my estimation, in the 10 years that I've been here, has always been that they're oriented towards improving themselves, right? And this kind, I mean, working with data and expanding their development of data analysis of the force is only going to improve themselves. And I'm very proud to be involved with them in that regard. And maybe that's from my, perspective as an outsider, you know what I mean? But I do believe that should be acknowledged in any kind of view of the Ottawa Police. That should be acknowledged.
If I could just ask on implicit bias, now how do you tackle implicit bias? I know it's a big question, but is it training? Is the number one means to tackle implicit bias is the training, cultural awareness, meeting the community? Like how do you tackle implicit bias? Because we all have our biases. It's a fact of life. And we all try and face them in a way, but how do you take a culture of an Ottawa police service or any police service? Because like you said, this is across police services. How do you take it and bring forward a means to reduce implicit bias, negative implicit bias?
So far, to tell you the truth, that training has had mixed results in terms of trying to impact implicit bias. And as you know, implicit bias is a tough one. We've all got it. Actually, the implicit bias experts have been around since the 1970s. They started in the States, right? They started studying this phenomenon, and they haven't made that many inroads on it. The issue is, I mean, they started the study of implicit bias by looking at neuroscience. Neuroscience found out that we only use about 11% of our brain, right? And so these social psychologists really said, well, if we're only using 11% of our brain, what does that mean to our thinking? And what they believed, I hypothesized, was that there's obviously parts of the brain that we are not able to access. There are unacknowledged or unconscious ideas that we have that are exposed in our behavior, but we're not even conscious. We're not even aware of it. And the difficult part of this, we all have these, right? I mean, you can go online. Harvard has got an online test for you, so you can test your implicit bias. But the problem is, the answer requires that individuals are vigorous about it. So you have to really be serious and dedicated to self-reflection to be able to eliminate your bias. Now, how do you put that into training? How do you put that into practice? How do you tell somebody that you need to be vigilant about your own thoughts, that you're not harming somebody else, either physically or psychologically, in terms of your attitude? I don't think that there's anything I can refer you to in terms of training that would resolve that problem yet. I hope that better instruments, better tools come along. But right now, the only good tools are to show us that we have implicit bias, right? Not how we can sort of resolve them. As far as I know, that's from my maybe limited investigations. That's what I can determine.
I can put that in. One is that in policing, anyhow, policing is not unique, because like Lauren said, implicit bias is a problem. It's a problem in education. It's a problem, and there are in certain contexts there are ways to well-known strategies. So a really good one is implicit bias around in systemic racism in education. A standard dictum is teachers have to have high expectations of all students. And so there's something that sort of sets it. Policing is not as simple as a throw off kind of phrase, but you can kind of see that there are certain. But what policing does have, as the teaching as there, is that the ideal is sometimes to reflect practice. Something that, you know, and that's sort of, we haven't really highlighted that here with OPS, but it's certainly something we've been working on for, you know, separate work. And reflective practice is a really promising way to move that forward, because it's not just reflecting, or reflecting as a practitioner. So you might have biases when you go home and whatever, you know, you might kind of do when you're, you know, shopping or, you know, talking to your neighbors. But when you're actually, as a police officer on duty, in that professional role, you actually have to reflect on what the biases are that you're bringing. And that's a step forward. But a couple of other pieces that are, and again, nothing may seem to be a bit anxious, but a couple of things we do know is that newer recruits, they may bring biases, but their biases are different and maybe on the issues of systemic racism different and maybe less problematic. And so one sort of, so this ideally over time, as you get more and more new recruits, it actually can diminish, particularly I think if you combine it with reflective practice. Like if you build that into how new recruits are even brought in, and that reflective practice is built into the very idea of what it means to be a police officer. And that could make a difference. And race itself in Canada, a lot of us in this room know that 25 years ago, Canadians were incredibly uncomfortable with that topic of race. And indeed, I always like to highlight that, you know, the part of the being Canadian problem, why we don't have a race data standard nationally, is because of really aggressive Justice Rosalie Abella, who served on the Supreme Court for many years, coined this idea in 1982 called visible minorities.
I'm sorry, this is a super important topic, but we do have other items on the agenda. I wouldn't want the chair to be accused in his first meeting of not following the agenda. I would just like to ask, and I'll give my non-committee members an opportunity for a question as well. I was really intrigued by some of the terminology when you mentioned perceived as being Black or perceived as being Middle Eastern. And is there then any form of quality control to validate whether that perception is in fact reality? And just a 30-second answer, if you don't mind.
Basically, what we're doing with data collections, we're not measuring race, we're measuring racism. So we're measuring people's actions based on their definitions or understandings of what somebody else is, right? So what we want to do to get a sense of what the bias or discrimination is analyze the officer's perception of race, right? Rather than what people think of themselves. You've probably heard of incidents where Sikh temples have been burned down because of Islamophobia, right? That's still Islamophobia, but that doesn't matter what the Sikh individual thinks or how they define themselves when that person who's perpetrating that act thinks that they're Muslim, or you know what I mean? So it really doesn't, self-identification doesn't matter when you're talking about racism and profiling.
Great, good.
Other identifications.
Great, thank you. And now I'll ask if the other board members that are present have a question, a quick question and a quick response for our guests.
A quick question, one question.
I think we have to limit it, unfortunately. We'll be back on the 30th of May with this topic at the board.
Yeah, so my questions are quick, easy to answer questions. I hope I could have a bit of latitude just so I understand what's coming forward. They're very practical questions.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. And the first question is, will this presentation be made public quickly? And will the numbers that you've given us with respect to overrepresentation in use of force incidents among some racialized groups, is that going to be written down as a publicly available number somewhere very soon?
So there's a board report that will be coming and will be published with the board agenda that will have full analytical information with all the appendices and all of the research data completed by the York team as well as CEC findings.
I'll ask my one practical, not practical question. There is an interesting quote in the presentation, or an interesting statement in the presentation, that while white male subjects are more likely to be actively resistant or assaulted, they are less likely to experience serious use of force outcomes. You've got the data to make that statement. How come we don't see the same analysis of that for Black, Indigenous, and Middle Eastern racialized groups today?
Well, that is there, and it could be analyzed. I would think that the main reason that there's not more sophisticated analysis going on with the data that we have is because of the requirements from the province to, they have limited the requirement in terms of sending in the use of force report. That's on top. So some analysis like that would be on top of what's absolutely required, but certainly it's available and possible to do analysis like that with the data we have. And as we go further, it should even be more improved in that regard.
So if I can just add to that, and that question is exactly why we're working with CEC community members and your research team to actually refine what are the data points that we need to draw on, how do we actually pull the information out of that, use that to direct operations. So we do have the data, we can collect it, we're refining through our community partners what is the best data to collect to help us decrease the disproportion.
I mean, it's a statement that you've been able to make with respect to white subjects and their
We
interactions.
do have it in the report.
It's in your, okay, perfect.
There is for all, well, actually for four.
Perfect. So I guess the thing is just to get that report into public hands as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very quickly, this is for the chief. You're just launching your big recruitment for those, right? And I'm thinking if there's a way that we can incorporate the help from Joan and her groups in the recruitment and the training of these new recruits, seeing that you're saying that we're probably going to see a shift in the younger generation, totally agree with you on that, but to sort of incorporate working together with the recruits and getting that trust right at the beginning. That's it.
So I'll start and then I'm going to turn it over to John. Part of CEC, there is actually a hiring and training committee, and it is one of our subcommittees that specifically work on the goals that you're talking about. Superintendent Zacharias has been a key leader in working with the CEC to help Jeff and his team actually develop and integrate those training practices. So something very front of mind to us. Absolutely. This data is only going to help support the augmentation or changes in training.
Wonderful. Good to hear. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, as mentioned earlier, this item will come forward at the May 30th board meeting. So I look forward to that. I look forward to that discussion. Now, a motion that the Policy and Governance Committee receive this item for information. Is the item received? Thank you. Okay, now we're going to move to the Strategy Corp proposal use of force policy review. This is a presentation by Strategy Corp, Matt Conley and Matt Turigian. This is tied to item number 1. We have representatives here with us from Strategy Corp to do a brief verbal presentation. We have Matt Conley, who's here in person, and Matt Turigian will be dialing in by phone. We'll be getting a hold of him. Welcome to the Matt. Before I turn things over, I'd like to have a few moments to provide some context. The previous board passed a motion in late 2020 related to use of force.
Completed.
Because
All right, go ahead and then I'll.
Sure. The previous board passed a motion in late 2020 related to use of force because they wanted to conduct a policy review in order to strengthen the board's oversight and governance of the use of force by the service. Some preliminary work took place, however, the bulk of the review was not completed. In light of the services report on the use of force race data, we thought it would be a good opportunity to invite Strategy Corp back to speak to this committee and our board and see if we want to move ahead with a policy review over the coming months. There were funds set aside in this year's budget to undertake this work. The initial proposal from Strategy Corp was circulated to the committee in advance of the meeting. I will now turn things over to Matt and hopefully a second Matt for a brief presentation, and then we can go to questions and comments. Mr. Connolly, over to you, and I think
Yeah.
you will have about 15 minutes or so, if that's sufficient.
Not a problem, absolutely.
Thank you.
Call cannot be completed as dialed.
I did. But I had to do a one. We're trying to do one.
Your call cannot be com-
Can you text Matt?
Your call cannot be completed as dialed. Please consult your directory and call.
What about using your cell phone?
You can call my cell phone if you like.
Well, you're gonna do it okay. We did test it out. I don't know.
Sorry about that. It was working earlier.
Hey Matt, it's Matt Conley here. So we couldn't get the Polygon working, so you're just on my cell phone, but everyone can hear you. Awesome. All right, so I'll get started with the presentation. So happy to be here to present on behalf of Strategy Corp. So I'm representing the team of four that previously worked with the previous board. So we have John Matheson, who's the partner for Strategy Corp. He leads our municipal practice and governance. He's a previous Mike staffer and has a variety of experience in doing strategic planning, budgeting, and governance pieces. We have David Slack, who's specialized in the municipal sector. He was a previous administrator with Peel, and previous work with the board. He got the nickname of Columbo for having that last question whenever cracked the case. And then, of course, we have Matt Tarajian, that needs no introduction. Was the chief of Waterloo, was chair of the Police Service Board's board, and also had a senior role with the Solicitor General. And I always feel a bit humbled when I introduce those three guys because they're the three wise men, and then there's me, Matt Conley, who's a manager of Strategy Corp. I'm a management consultant. I was a previous management consultant with Deloitte for 4 years, and then I also worked for the Minister of Immigration. And I was the guy that the MPs had on speed dial if someone's about to get deported. So regardless if you're a conservative, liberal, NDP, they called me up and said, hey, this guy's getting deported, or we need a visa, or we need any part of the immigration process. So we're very closely with public safety and immigration on that standpoint. So just to give a brief introduction of how we got here, as you mentioned, there's a previous motion that was passed by the board to be able to look at use of force. We were hired back in June of 2021. We're to do the use of force piece, strategic planning, and the budget. During that time, the budget took up the majority of the work that we were able to accomplish, and we worked very closely with the service and Chief Bell to be able to reach the outcome that we achieved by the end of the year. In January 2022, we were approached again to begin phase 2, which was when we put in the use of force. However, due to the convoy, we were able to begin our process, which leads us here today. And first of all, just an excellent presentation that we saw today on the data that's being collected. And as part of our process, we're happy to use that data and work with the service in a collaborative way to make sure that we're providing advice, recommendations on how best to approach and look at that data. So one thing I just want to clarify, because actually we got this question quite a bit from the previous board, was around the use of force standards. And so the first question we get is, so you're going to tell us when the police get to use tasers, right? And that's not the case at all. That's set by the Solicitor General of Ontario. There's the act that's very prescriptive as far as how far the board can go. But we're here to provide support and advice on what the board can do as far as use of force and providing that oversight. And so we heard a lot about the data collection and a lot of materials that are being implemented by the service we're here to work with the board and the service to be able to set that policy of how best to adjudicate that. And if you're receiving the data, what to make of that data, how to interpret it, and use our skills and expertise to be able to support the board in that. So certainly we'd be looking for the board for what their expectations are, what they're looking to achieve, because ultimately it's about fit. It's about how best the board wants to provide that oversight. And so we're happy to find the best fit based on our expertise. So what we're proposing is a 9-week process where we will conduct an environmental scan of police boards in Ontario, possibly other parts of the country, to be able to get the best practices, to be able to see what's working in other places, to be able to advise Ottawa. We'll also assess the current state in conjunction with the service, just to ensure that if there's any gaps, to be able to look at that part of it there. Midway through the process, we'll provide an update, whether that's verbal or reports, at discretion of the board. And then after that, we'll work closely with the service to incorporate any additional data collection and any additional policies that they see fit. And then finally, as well, if there's any other public consultation data or anything, there are other reports that the board's collected, we'll also happily work there. And then we'll look to provide a written report for the board to be able to use and adjust and discuss that report along with the service and the board. And so I'll turn it over to Matt Turigian if there's any other comments or anything else you'd like to say as well.
Thank you, Matt. I think you covered it well. Just going to try to summarize what you when you develop a policy for the board. Just want to make sure that you have all the information provided to the board by the service, and you're confident that the standards are being met. And I know there's also that role that will come into fruition with the Inspector General, but it won't be at the frequency that you would want to see as a board. So all the information to come to you in the frequency that you would describe through your policy.
Absolutely, for sure. And as mentioned, we're here to work collaboratively. We're not here, to be hostile to anyone. It's ultimately we all win, we all work together, and Ottawa's my community as well. And certainly we want the best outcome to be able to provide transparency and to be able to advise the board. So open to your questions, and hopefully if we're selected to proceed again, we're ready to go whenever you get it. So.
Great. Thank you for that, Matt.
Absolutely.
And thank you, Matt, for coming in by phone. I'll pass it to my fellow committee members if you have any questions.
So Matt, if I may, Mr. Chair, so you're saying you'll be willing to work with OPS staff, and you saw they have done quite a bit of work so far. And I'm trying to find so what would change from your group from what we hear here? Because as you know, the board obviously can direct the chief and his staff to go modify, do more, give us more of this, more of this. So I'm trying to wrap my mind, see your group, strategic core, what would they do for the board would be different from what we heard earlier from our staff.
So today's presentation was very thorough, and although it's new information to us, so we would want to be able to sit down with the service to be able to discuss that a bit more in depth. But ultimately, though, we want to be able to do a gap analysis as far as what's happening nationally, just to make sure and just provide that, so that's certainly clarity to the board of what's being proposed is consistent and is keeping with best practices. Again, I agree with you. It's very thorough was presented today, and there's a lot to unpack there, but that's always a little bit more of a chance to sit down as far as methodologies. That's as far as we can go today.
So again, I'm trying to see. I'm not sure if Chief and you're in a position to respond. What the board needs really is the information we just saw. And we saw some of the folks asking for a little bit more gender, age. And because the number is small, it's different than the traffic stop. So any number will make a big difference, right? But when we talk about small numbers. So my understanding, the board need to understand as a whole, we have this information, we're collecting this information, we have the partner, the community helping us to analyze this information. we want to present them to the board, whatever, semi-annually or quarterly, so the board can understand what's happening. We heard from members, from Madam Vice Chair about the recruiting. We heard about training. If you remember, I had championed through the ministry in the past. I know police officers are allowed to use of force, but can you review, tell us what level of use of force can apply? Like you have 1 to 10. Should you go to 10 right away, or should you go 1 and then go to? So this discussion been for quite some time, but I want to see before let's agree to continue with strategic work. We saw what we saw earlier, and I'm not sure I'm going to see more. And I know you're going to say, well, the previous board has requested, but that's not my issue. My issue, I want to make sure I'm going to see a benefit from 2 different groups. So one proposed for the service, but your proposal is our proposal at the end of the day, because we're the board, we're the policy people.
So, yeah, a couple things on that. We don't have enough data. And I think that's where we're starting from, is we don't have enough of the good, cleanest, best collected data. That's why we bring the foremost experts in data collection around this area in to help support us. That's why we bring the community in to help guide and direct exactly what areas of data we should be collecting. But then to move that beyond, you talk about having us understand on the 1 to 10, you used a 10 force, community thinks you should have used a 3 level of force. Those are the important discussions that we're going to actually have through the committee that we're developing, the use of force working group through the Community Equity Council, where we will take our use of force reporting, we will present them to community members, and they will see from beginning to end exactly what transpired, what occurred, to be able to give us input, insight, to be able to identify some of those areas of implicit or explicit bias that we may not see, to help us improve our outcomes around those areas. So all of those issues that you're talking about are important and are incorporated into what we're looking to develop. We would propose, and we'll work with yourselves, Community Equity Council, that we should be reporting use of force data on a quarterly basis. That as we go through this, it should be regular reporting as we go through the year, as we improve and increase in our abilities and complexity to collect, analyze, and report on that data. So that's a commitment from us that we will be doing. And in that, with any new report, with any new collection of information, we will work with the board to actually identify what are the key indicators that you're looking for, what is the reporting mechanism that you're looking for, and we will bring that forward. That is part of our plan.
So Matt, I'll just plug you in as well. So the question was, how does strategy provide value? So I just wanted to get your comments as well. Yep. So basically, the question was around how does Strategy Core intend to add value as far as the work that's already being done and working with the service? What's the additional value add that we provide?
Well, I think just partial first and third part viewing the data that you collect, data that chief responsible with we understand that working across the country, just looking at what the various types of policies some boards have and provide that and circle back onto that, see that the overreaching elements of some policies that the board would like to, there are other parts that they would like, but combine that with the experience that we have with them. So I think that's the value add that we would provide. And all of that, of course, working with the service as well.
So I'm taking, and just the question I have is, it's more than just the RICs. You guys are going to look at all the policies and all best practices across all police service boards. Is that what you would bring? I'm also having a difficult time understanding the value added.
For sure.
And maybe it was because the previous board, was on the track and
So under the previous board, we reached out to the larger police boards in Ontario, and so we requested data of how they do it, and we were able to receive that data. So we conducted an initial scan, but we would also look at any relevant larger cities So for example, Calgary, Edmonton, just basically just to be able to provide a firm understanding, firm examples of where Ottawa stacks up against the others. And again, certainly to the extent we'll work with the board to be able to determine the number of boards that we need to look at, but we want to be thorough with it. We want to make sure that we're looking at all the relevant jurisdictions that compare to the size law. Yeah.
Standards, regulations, there would be sample board policies, use of boards for that one, of course. That would be like a template, and there would be services that would basically take that template and board and use it as their policy. And very often, because of the lack of resources boards, the policies get written by the service staff because there are people there doing work and then present to the board as the draft and board will set it or not. But there's a need really, but certainly in emerging best practices that boards probably follow themselves. And the challenge, of course, is that they are not always resourced well enough to do that. To have some respect a contractor do that. Sure, the board is acting as independent governance and oversight body, and it may be exactly what the service would present or what the chief and the staff would present, but it's the role of the board to do, and therefore the value add is actually establishing continued good practice of making sure that the board does the work of the board.
From the perspective of the board's use of force policies as they are today, and moving forward with the comparative study of, I think I can infer mostly Ontario
Yes.
Police Services Board, with potentially a couple of selected ones outside of the province. How would you rate our policies today? I know that a lot of the work will be doing that comparison, but what are your thoughts on the current policies that the board has compared to other police forces that you've engaged with?
So my understanding from the initial scan is, as Matt mentioned, they're quite similar to other jurisdictions in the province. And again, it's just a function of that in the effort to make sure that there's a policy there. They're quite similar to what's already in place. And so we'd be looking to, like I said, do that gap analysis and make sure that we're enhancing to be able to accommodate what's Ottawa's needs.
So if I understand correctly, it's more of an augmentation of the policies as opposed to just a straight comparison.
Correct.
Thank you. Yes, Madam Vice Chair.
Have you ever done this kind of thing before on use of force specifically? Have you ever come up with new strategies for use of force policies for other boards?
So not directly. Again, Strategy Corps has a longstanding history of governance work and working with boards. We haven't done use of force specifically, but we're confident between our team and especially with the guidance of Natural Region that we got the skills to be able to adjudicate that.
Thank you. Thank you. So the motion presented is that the Policy and Governance Committee recommend that the Ottawa Police Services Board procure a Strategy Corp consulting firm, a vendor of record with the province, to conduct a review of the board's use of force policies and make recommendations with respect to the board's oversight and governance role in relation to use of force. Is the item carried?
No, so we just receive it here because we have to carry it on the board. That's my concern. The committee cannot carry it.
Does the committee want to recommend that the board or?
I think we need to have a little more discussion from what I'm hearing from Celine. So if we can just receive it and then from now to the board, hopefully we'll.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Matt.
Okay, our third item, new board policy, disconnecting from work. We have the executive director's report. The executive director prepared a report and draft policy that was circulated in advance to the committee. The policy is largely based on the policy prepared by the Toronto Police Services Board. However, it has been amended in consultation with staff at the OPS to ensure alignment with the corresponding service policy. Are there any questions or comments on the report policy?
No, but maybe we can give Krista 5 minutes to explain it, what we're trying to achieve here, if you don't mind.
Sure. There were some changes made to the Occupational Health and Safety Act, which required all employers with, I believe, 25 or more employees to have a policy in place regarding disconnecting from work. And there was a couple guidance points that were released with that policy requirement. Most police boards were only made aware of this in early May, so we didn't get a lot of lead time or notice about the policy requirement. However, the Toronto Police Services Board did consult with legal and HR professionals and put together a pretty comprehensive policy. So as a starting point, I referred to that because no other boards in the province at the time had a policy in place, and then working closely with some policy as well as the labor relations staff at the service, we kind of put together our own policy and made sure that the board policy aligns with what the service is currently putting together.
So, Mr. Chair, this is obviously something new, and we didn't have a lot of time to be able to, other than Toronto out of the Big 12, I don't believe anyone has that policy in place as we speak. So it's important to have as a board policy and work with the service. Once we have a policy, so the service will have to implement this policy on behalf of the board.
Yeah, so am I able to ask a question? Sure. So for my purposes, the policy you're laying out achieves two things, correct? It is a policy for board as an employer of its employees that is being developed, as well as a policy that directs myself to develop a policy, an operational policy internal to achieve this, correct?
Correct.
Okay, good. Just so I understand, because I think there's two distinct pieces within it. You as an employer of employees, and you as an employer of myself to direct me to have an operational policy. Okay, thank you. That's just the clarity I want to have.
And it's for your civilian.
That's
Correct. Yeah, only the civilians.
That's your civilian.
Yes, I remember that note.
Any other questions?
I just want to say thank you to Krista, because it came to us really in a short notice, and I was scrambling what we're going to do, and said, well, let me check with the Big 12, and we find out none of them have other than Toronto. So we modified to fit out, because we don't have a lot of time. So we have to have that direction, as the chief called it, by May 30th. So or by June.
June 1st, it has to be released to the members.
So that's why we brought it here quickly, and we didn't know much about it.
So, Mr. Chair, just so you know, our policy is completed. It's in the final stages of being approved. I know Krista's been involved in that oversight. So we will meet those deadlines.
Great, that's good to hear.
Thank you. So the motion is that the Policy and Governance Committee recommend that the Ottawa Police Services Board approve the new proposed board policy entitled Disconnecting from Work. Is the item carried? Yes. And that's it for our formal agenda. Is there any other business?
Other than to say you rescued that, Mr. Chair, it was going off water.
Well, we have a few minutes to spare now. You know, it's always tough to cut such an engaging conversation at the end of the day. And I think we'll bear that in mind on May 30th going forward, that there'll be a lot of conversation, a lot of questions at the board meeting as well.
So I'm happy, Mr. Chair, and Chris, to work with you in terms of exactly what sort of package you want to see from a presentation perspective, whether you want less presentation and more time for dialogue or a ballot. So we're very open to listening to your direction in terms of how you want to frame it. And to the point of if while we'll cut down other portions, I'll have a shorter report, things like that, to make sure we have maximum time to have discussion.
Are you anticipating bringing the same players?
Yeah, well, more. So we'll have other representatives from the Community Equity Council. We hope to have both co-chairs there, Sahara Lola and Jalil Marouj. will be present with us, as well as Lauren and Les will also be in attendance to answer questions that I just think they bring absolute value to the conversation.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you. Any other business? Thank you.
To answer your question, I think the presentation was great, it was long. Actually for the board, but maybe we need to work with the executive director to see which one of the important to bring to the board. Obviously, most of the stuff we learned through the question, right? But we have so many questions. I'm always worried about the percentage, because percentage on a small scale, one time people in West Carleton, they were out of their mind. The crime was 200% up. Is before we had one, now we have two. So yes, those numbers really we need to put it in a perspective. Because when I give the example and I ask them about the traffic stop or the rate traffic stop, there was a huge number, but still almost give you the same number in the end. More blacks, more Middle Eastern, more indigenous people. Now, if we can package it to a way that so we can understand it. I know the number is not as big. It's not 100,000 people we stopped. We stopped 350 or whatever the number was. But that, I need that to be explained in a way so people can understand. We're not hiding any number, but I just want people to understand what you are comparing.
We raised, and I completely agree with you. We're actually trying to, as we approach this, raise it up one level. The findings of the traffic stop race data collection, the findings of the use of force race data collection, the anecdotal information we get point to the same issue. They point to the disproportionate policing outcomes for members of our Indigenous, racialized, and vulnerable communities. So I don't want to have more use of force numbers. Actually, I want to have zero use of force numbers, but it doesn't take away from this is identifying an issue within policing, within our society that we need to address, and that's where our commitment is. So regardless of the body of the numbers, that the number of pieces we're pulling out, we've actually concluded it's very consistent with information that we've received before, and that's why we've put the pieces in place that try and address it at a larger level and specifically around use of force. And I'm sorry, no, it's up there.
No, I'm good. It's okay.
So the other thing that John mentioned, and that's important to us, though, Ottawa is very attractive to Indigenous community to visit. Per capita, we have quite a bit of visit from Inuit community, Indigenous. And she made the point as a city councilor now. So I felt that, yeah, she's right. We don't have enough social housing. These people come to the city, obviously with some eviction mixed with other things. The only engagement we don't have with the police because we have no place for them to stay. So that need to somehow understood among us. Like sometimes it's not everything is a police solution. Like when we talk about the community safety and well-being with you and your staff, we're not talking about everything we have to do or everything we have to conquer. But we need to put it on the table. This is a dialogue. This is community health and social worker and police. We're all in it together. But I mean, we're the one who are dealing with it, and we're the one who are reporting those numbers. But those numbers, they are what they are because of the lack of housing we have in the city to be able to deal with the social impact.
So,
No, I don't have
sorry,
anything to say.
but I think you heard Joan specifically reference the progressiveness of the Ottawa community, particularly around community safety well-being. She said, to paraphrase her, the police have this responsibility in terms of how they engage with Indigenous people within our community. Indigenous service providers have this responsibility to be able to make sure that there's 24/7 access. We all have a role to play. That's where in Ottawa, I actually think we're fortunate. That's probably why we're farther ahead in many areas, is that we recognize that there needs to be collaboration. This isn't a police problem or a housing problem or an education problem. This is an Ottawa problem. And that's why we're here to try and collectively, collaboratively engage in those solutions.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Suzanne Oberaya, I may not be pronouncing her name properly. She's head of the same thing that your group is head of at the city.
Very stable, so, yeah.
So are you working with the city, with her?
So the short answer is absolutely, and I'm gonna tell you, I'm a huge fan. I could not work with Suzanne O'Brien enough.
Yeah.
She is so progressive, so collaborative. We have very good connections with the city because they're a key stakeholder. So the short answer is absolutely.
Good. So there is a working group that, as Eli was mentioning, represented at the table that you're all working together towards that same goal.
So there's several of them, and if you look at the community safety and well-being plan, there's 6 different pillars.
Okay.
They're currently using what this police board directed in terms of developing the guiding council as the model on how to look at community engagement, community collaboration in every different stream. We will be present in the streams where we're responsible. I think that's every one of them. And we'll be collaboratively working in that. We've already started around mental health. We're continuing to work around homelessness, food sustainability, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So there is a lot of collaborative work going on. But it's not just us, it's the community as well.
Right. Well, that's really good to know. I'm glad to hear that. Talking about the racial traffic stop data, I remember this from, when, what was it, 20?
When we were young.
Yeah. Has that moved? Has that changed at all? Like the results that that it does? It has in the better
Yes, the
direction?
disproportionalities were still there, but they were lower in the second report, which we released in 2019, the same time as the diversity audit report. So we were dealing with quite a lot of recommendations, which then led to the action plan in January 2020.
Perfect.
Which we're looking forward to provide information on. So the other thing to build on the question that's important is we did a report, collected data, we did analysis. We did a report, collected data, we did analysis. There was 3 or 4 years in between. This is a maturation of that. We need to collect this data on an ongoing basis. There needs to be continual analysis and operational refinements moving ahead. So this is the next iteration.
So who in your group is responsible for collecting that data?
So right now we're working to develop what that data is we're collecting, how we're collecting it, and we're currently, and I believe as of yesterday, we have posted a race data specialist who's going to come into our organization and help identify and refine exactly how that's collected.
Very good. Great. Bravo.
And Suzanne and Heather Freeman, they will be presenting at FEDCO about that race. So if you are interested, I can send you a quick note in June, and she's going to, because I met with them today.
Excellent. Thank you. That's all. Thank you.
No,
Mr.
that's
Chair.
fantastic. Thank you.
No, but maybe we can stay a little bit after the staff go, if you don't mind, just for 5 minutes.
Great.
Not a meeting, just.
Not a meeting.
No, it's just squash.
Great, thank you. The next meeting date is to be determined. These are quarterly, I take it.
Or whenever they need.
Yeah.
Whenever needed. Okay, perfect. Thank you. And can I please ask for a motion for adjournment? Thank you to everybody for your participation.
Congratulations on your chair.
Yes.